Well, welcome back to another episode of Finance Uncut. On today's episode, we're going to discuss, is the Aussie property market about to crash? The Australian housing market could see a historic crash. There's a worrying sign in the Australian housing market, with one state seeing prices fall at more than double the rate of the 2008 US housing crash. In the 2015 award-winning film The Big Short, Steve Carell and Christian Bale star in a tale about the greed and systemic risks surrounding the US subprime housing bubble and how it led to one of the most painful housing crashes in history. Using celebrities such as Margot Robbie and Selena Gomez to explain some of the more abstract concepts of finance and real-world examples such as an exotic dancer having 5 investment properties, the film painted a picture of American greed and regulatory failure. The American subprime lending bubble and the eventual housing crash has become a cautionary tale the world over. In the years since, Australians have often liked to comment on how we are different, whether it's around a backyard barbecue or a high-powered CEO addressing the media. What are we? It's no secret that Australia has one of the highest levels of household debt in the world. In fact, as of the most recent comparable data, we have almost 50% more debt than the Americans did during the absolute height of their pre-global financial crisis debt binge. But this is nothing new. Australians have carried more household debt than Americans for the past 20 years. However, with the advent of the cerveza sickness and more than 5 million people being supported by the government's JobKeeper and JobSeeker programs, there are signs that the Aussie property market may be following the same trajectory as the Americans did during the GFC. PEXA, an e-conveyancing firm made up by the various privatised land registry offices, recently authored a report into the direction of housing prices in our 2 most populous states, New South Wales and Victoria. According to PEXA, from the start of the year until the end of September, housing prices in New South Wales are down 9%, and in Victoria, prices were down a whopping 14%. Commercial property in New South Wales also fared extremely poorly, with prices down 14% in the first 9 months of the year. Price drops of up to 14% paints a pretty concerning picture for the nation's property market. But how does it compare with the Big Short's housing crash? Well, according to the preferred benchmark, the Case-Shiller National House Price Index, in the first 9 months of the Americans' Great Recession, housing prices fell by 6.6%. And here's a chart that shows that, so you can see Victoria's property price fall for the first 9 months this year, the first 9 months of New South Wales, and this was the first 9 months of the US property market crash. Put into contrast with the numbers provided by PEXA for property price falls in New South Wales and Victoria, the falls they are experiencing are disastrous. In New South Wales, prices are falling 37% faster than America's were when they were crashing in 2008. For Victoria, the numbers are even more concerning, with prices falling at more than double the rate of the US housing crash. For a nation like Australia that eats, sleeps, and breathes property and property investment, these figures are practically blasphemous. Even with more than 3.5 million workers being supported by JobKeeper, hundreds of thousands of mortgages and business loans in deferral, and unprecedented support from the Morrison government, PEXA's data shows prices falling at an alarming rate. But amid the storm clouds, a break in the weather may be looming on the horizon, if only for a little while. In September, housing prices in New South Wales showed a near 1% gain for the month. However, PEXA's report also warned that scaling back labour market support would likely put further downward pressure on house price growth and housing activity in the medium term. It's likely you may not have heard of PEXA, but with the company processing 20,000 property transactions every week, provides an extremely rich and comprehensive data source for Australian housing price data. However, where PEXA differs from other housing price data providers is that it provides the median price for all transactions within a given period. It therefore provides a very broad overview of a state's property market rather than the more targeted approach that takes into account significantly more variables, often down to the single property level. Whether PEXA or one of their other competitors provides the most accurate snapshot of a state's property market is a question for the statisticians and market analysts. But it nonetheless has provided a great deal of food for thought for any and all interested in outcomes for the property market, which I'm guessing is just about every Australian. If PEXA's data is correct, and New South Wales and Victoria's property markets are falling significantly faster than the American property during the global financial crisis, then the Aussie property market may be at risk of a historic housing crash. With the conclusion of JobKeeper for its 3.5 million recipients still to come, along with the end of loan deferrals for hundreds of thousands of borrowers, it's possible that without further intervention from the Morrison government, prices may continue to fall. It's important to keep in mind that the economic aspect of the cerveza sickness was largely stopped in its tracks in much of the world through the power of around tens of trillions of dollars in global stimulus. And maybe we'll do another video on that. Now, as that stimulus runs out and much of the northern hemisphere heads back into some degree of lockdown due to the explosion in the cerveza sickness cases, it's possible we could see a perfect storm of international factors impacting our banks and property market in the months and years ahead. Whether high property prices will survive yet another global crisis relatively unscathed through the power of government and RBA intervention remains to be seen. But if PEX's warnings of housing prices declining further in the medium term prove to be accurate, it may only be the beginning of the pain for property owners. In this current economic climate, forecasting the property market is challenging to say the least. With the likelihood of further government intervention to prevent price falls, it becomes even more problematic. Ultimately, if a convergence of global and domestic factors all come together to form a perfect storm for the property market, these existing price falls may only be the beginning of the big short of the Aussie housing market. So here's a chart, not a chart, we don't want to be doing any of those. Here's a chart of household debt to GDP. Stephen, get your head out of the gutter. You can see here that Australia's household debt to GDP is the highest in the developed world. Household debt to income, we're pushing that 200% mark. Once again, taking the record there. And this is what Tarek was saying, that our debt levels is just so much higher than what the US had. In fact, if you go back to 1991, I believe it is, the data says that Australia's household debt to income ratio was 40%. So a little under 30 years ago, it was 40%. So when people say, well, interest rates were really, really, really high, well, they're only high for 18 months. And at the same time, price to household debt to income was 40%. And I think I've done in another video where I've talked about interest rates during that time period and debt levels versus interest rates at today's levels. But we've just got super high household debt to income. We've really, our economy has really been all about the property market and mining, obviously digging stuff up, sending it overseas, and just throwing massive debt to the housing market. And then when that starts to let's do some intervention. Let's get the RBA, the government. Let's intervene. Let's increase immigration. Well, we'll have a look at some of the headwinds in a second regarding that. Our debt service ratio, once again, highest. We take the gold medal in all those things. And let's not forget that properties in Australia have fallen. You can see in this chart here, we've got Darwin peaked in 2014, and look where Darwin's gone. It's about a 40% fall. Perth, I think it's about a 20% fall, also peaked in 2014 and has been going down. And you can see the falls once again in Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane back a couple of years ago. And we'll have a look at that here. So, and this is coming from CoreLogic, and I've shared this chart in another video, but in that period of 2018-19, for that 12-month period, so we can see here it's an annual change, and in that 12-month period, Melbourne 10%, Brisbane a lot less, Perth quite a bit as well, and Darwin quite a bit as well. But the point I'm making here is we didn't have the headwinds that we do today. So, we had relatively low unemployment a couple of years ago. We had mass immigration and very cheap interest rates, credit was you know was just it was what it was. Um, we had no shutdowns, lockdowns. There was no headwinds that we have now. There was no job keeper, job seeker because people had jobs. People were out there working, and yet properties could fall by this much in a 12-month period. What do we think's going to happen when all this support mechanisms come off? When people eventually go, you know what, I'm not going to be able to come off these mortgage deferrals. I'm going to have to sell the house, or the banks make them sell the house. Um, there's so many headwinds coming for the property market. You could see here. So post-COVID, look, credit availability, credit's probably loosened a little bit, and probably will loosen as the responsible lending laws are kind of torn up. Price of credit. Well, the price of credit really isn't getting any cheaper. The banks haven't passed on the latest rate cut, and they're probably not going to be passing on any more rate cuts because the further the RBA cuts rates, and at these low rates, it starts to begin to become unprofitable for the banks to lend, and negative interest rates. The evidence that we're seeing is negative interest rates. Also makes it very difficult for banks to be able to create loans and lend. So the price of credit probably isn't going to get any cheaper. If the price of credit gets cheaper, then credit availability will dry up because the banks just won't lend because it becomes unprofitable for them to lend. So, we're seeing that. Employment, we'll have a look at the employment data from Roy Morgan in a second. But employment, we had 5.2% back a couple of years ago when we had property price falls. You'll see what unemployment is according to Roy Morgan. It has improved slightly from 12.9% to 12.8%, but we'll have a look at that in a second. And I've shared in other videos that in 1991, the recession we had back then, how mild it was compared to now in terms of the GDP fall. When unemployment hit double digits, it took nearly 5 years for unemployment to come back down under double digits, and it took actually the whole decade to get back to its pre-recession unemployment numbers. So if we think that unemployment's going to go back to 5.2% next year or the year after, and I know that there's some economists out there pushing that, and even the RBA's got models out there that look pretty rosy. It ain't going to happen. It'll be a miracle if it happens, because when you look at past recessions, that just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. So unemployment is going to be a big headwind. Population growth. We know that for the next 2 years, we're going to have negative net immigration into Australia. So population growth is not going to drive the property market like it has. Foreign buyers, well, they're not here like they used to be. We do incentives and stuff like that, but with all the government incentives that the Morrison government has thrown out there has been towards building new property. So when and all the demand that we're seeing in our business is for new homes. So that is more supply coming onto the market, and without the immigration, without the population, we are probably going to see an oversupply of property, especially in the apartment market where we've already got that, we've already seen that, but it's probably going to get worse. So if we have a look at, back here. So here's the Roy Morgan data. So you can see here, and I like to use Roy Morgan data, not the ABS data. So Roy Morgan's got unemployment at 12.8%, and we've got unemployment and underemployment at 22.2%. So we've got an unemployment problem, and we've still got the government support how much more can the government continue to throw more and more at the Australian housing market? Now, we've seen the Commonwealth Bank and that they are going to extend the out to September. Now, they're not doing that because they love their customers. They're not doing that because they're nice. They're doing that to save their own bacon. When you look at the balance sheet, you look at the amount of non-performing loans, because that's what they are, non-performing loans. It really it threatens their balance sheet, their solvency, and all these issues. And so they're doing this out of self-interest, not they don't want to see a housing market crash. They don't want to see massive defaults from their customers. They want to try to help their customers because that helps themselves. So what do you all think? Love to see your comments below. Do you think we're going to see a housing market crash? Or do you think housing it's the right time to jump in? I no longer do price predictions, whether it's going to fall or grow by 10% or 20%, 30%. I no longer do that anymore because what I've found is that no one knows. Everybody has an opinion, and throughout history, people predict things, and 99.9% of the time they are wrong, and it's just mere luck that they get it right. However, I think it's fair to say, from my point of view, I am still bearish on the Australian housing market. I think all the headwinds are pushing on Australian housing, and that is why the Morrison government, the RBA, are doing all they can to intervene to keep the bubble from bursting. And the question is, how long can they continue to do that for without maybe damaging the dollar? I personally, I'm bearish at the Australian housing market, but it'll take time to play out. And I don't think that the Australian government and the RBA can continue to intervene long term. Otherwise, they're going to create a whole world of pain in other areas of the economy. So anyway, that's my opinion. Love to see yours in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the channel. Love to get more and more people being educated and checking out my videos, and hopefully you find a bit of value and education in them, as well as my opinions and where I'm doing, how I'm managing my assets, and where I'm investing and where I'm not investing, etc., etc. So hopefully that helps you. But anyway, thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you again on another episode of Finance Uncut.